So I want to start to talk about two declarations of UNESCO today. One is the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights, and the other is the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. Have you heard of UNESCO? The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. So it was established at the end of World War II so that in the minds of men we would not make war but make peace. The E in UNESCO stands for what? United Nations Educational, okay, and S is for science, scientific, and the cultural organization. Okay. So that's the abbreviation. Now the reason that the S is included is because of the lobbying of a famous scientist called Julian Huxley. And he was to become the first Secretary Director General of UNESCO. He was an English scientist, and he was famous. Huxley's family was famous in the development of science in the UK. So there needed to be a UN body to look at science. So one of the key features of UNESCO is the promotion of the activities of the mind to work for creativity. Science, for example. And we have natural science and social science. So the development of knowledge is based on our freedom of inquiry. So we have freedom to explore different things. One is the freedom to develop a religion, the freedom to create a wheel, the freedom to cultivate plants, the freedom to choose who we marry, the freedom to choose when we die. Is that the freedom? The freedom to choose how many children to have? The freedom to choose if those children should be boys or girls? Is that a freedom we should have? The freedom to choose whatever country we want to live in? The freedom to study if we want to study, and not to study if we don't want to study. We always have freedoms. So human rights is a way that we could start to discuss these things. So in the 1993, UNESCO established what was called the International Bioethics Committee. And it was a group of 53 individual scientists from around the world to discuss bioethical issues. And in particular, in 1993, the focus was on what do we do with the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project was the project to sequence all the DNA of the human being, the genome. Actually, as we know now, it was, our body is at least 100 species in general, 17 species that everybody in the world has in their body. They're ubiquitous, we say. And the Homo sapien is one of these species. There are more cells in our body that are not Homo sapien than are Homo sapien. Okay? And there are at least 16 other species found in every human being, and a total, on average, of 100 species found in our body. So actually the sequencing of the human genome was the sequencing of the Homo sapien genome, not necessarily the human genome. The human genome sequence, we now know that many of these other species are sequenced, many microorganisms. Some microorganisms are very small, and they were easier to sequence first. But some microorganisms' genome is very large. Do you know viruses? We sometimes get viruses. We carry viruses. Some viruses are very small, easy to sequence. And some viruses have 1 million base pairs. Megaviruses have larger genomes than some bacteria. So the more we understand about DNA, the more we ask many questions. But the questions that we're asking for the Human Genome Project were, what should we do with the knowledge? Okay? So if we have the knowledge about ourselves, could we understand when we get sick, how long we're going to live? When will be the age of onset of Huntington's disease? When will be the difference between somebody whose brain develops very well and somebody who doesn't have a brain and spelling or almost no brain? How do we work out the differences between people? Why are some people good at art and some people good at mathematics and some people good at language? Is it just some people good at interactions with people and learning and other people are not good at learning? So all these questions were there. And another aspect of the 1980s was the central dogma. The central dogma of molecular biology was that there was a one-way flow from DNA to RNA to protein. And this is a one-way flow in the 1980s model. Now, for those who learned their molecular biology later, they know that it's a two-way flow at each point. It goes back and forth. But I did my doctorate in molecular biology in 1984 to 1987, and at that time we believed in the central dogma. DNA goes to RNA, goes to protein. So that the genome, the DNA, will be the basis of all information, and it encodes so much that we have to try and understand it. In 1990, when I wrote my first book called Shaping Genes, the ethics and legal issues of genetic technology, I wrote, as we commonly felt in the genome community, that there was 100,000 genes, human genes. So it was a big surprise 15 years later, in 2004 and 2005, when the human genome sequence was completed, that there were only 25,000 genes. Yet wheat has 70,000 genes. Why does wheat need 70,000 genes and human beings have only 25,000 genes? Isn't that strange? Is wheat more complicated than human beings? Well, yes, in some ways it is. Wheat plants have to stay in one place and survive somehow. They cannot move to another environment when it gets cold or hot or dry or wet. They have to synthesize all their amino acids from basic proteins, basic chemicals. So to make all the proteins in our body, we need to eat food with amino acids, and that's what you just did at lunchtime. You ate protein, which will allow you not to have 70,000 genes, but only 25,000 genes. So that's why we have less genes, as we eat proteins that have amino acids and digest them in a way that we can then put those amino acids into constructing the proteins we want, which is remarkable in the sense that with a digestive system that can digest a molecule so that only it is not totally destroyed, that it's down to a building block, amino acid, that then we can use to build something else. If any of you played with Lego or little building blocks as children, you know that you can make little building blocks, and from the building blocks you can make things. It's easier than having to build everything from atoms at the beginning again. So that's why we only have 25,000 genes. But the information we were concerned about in the social science community, in philosophy, was how are we going to use this information? What is that information going to become? Because if it's so powerful that DNA makes RNA makes protein, we thought it would be so deterministic for everything that we do. So this International Bioethics Committee was established in 1993. I was the youngest member of that committee, and it was my privilege to be on with many very wise and senior people, and from over 30 countries of the world, and we met twice a year to discuss and to try to develop a declaration. So we have the declaration on the screen. The cover is called the Universal Declaration on the Human Rights, from theory to practice. And I'm going to start with this declaration and read some of the text that is written here. But I wanted to add some personal touch because of being one of the members of the committee to develop this. And it's unusual that a declaration, this was, it takes 5 years. It had 10 drafts. 10 drafts were circulated around the world in this process. And this is the final text adopted by all the countries of Unesco. So that was interesting exercise. I have people from every community, and I remember fondly our discussions that we had. The timing was not a coincidence. If you know the United Nations, it's a political entity. It involves politics. And it wanted to have a declaration, firstly, to show that it was doing something about science and technology. Secondly, it might be useful for governing, for countries to govern the use of science and technology. And thirdly, 1998 was going to be the 50 years anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a foundational document of the United Nations and of modern international order. So to have the 50 years anniversary, to have another text to celebrate and show that the international community was still working together would be politically quite insignificant for the United Nations. So this was a context that was not only needed from social scientists and scientists who wanted to look at the governance of science, and many people worried about the human genome and biotechnology, but also it was a timely event. I will read some parts of this text. This is a reader discovering the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights, adopted by the General Conference of UNESCO at the 29th session, 1997. It will be, I think, be struck by two things. First, the scope of the text, which in a scientific and political context marked by such burning issues as manipulations of the human genome, human cloning and transgenesis, affirms or reaffirms intangible principles and values. And second, by many different actors concerned, due to several factors. The inherent nature of the subject, which, like all ethical issues, lies at the interface of several disciplines. The universality of its approach, which should be informed by a public debate involving all components of society. The diversity of the economic, social, and cultural context in which ethical thinking takes root throughout the world. For the thinking of each people develops in accordance with its own distinctive nature, as shaped by history and traditions, legal, political, philosophical, religious, etc. In view of the new ethical issues raised by a sometimes astounding pace of progress in the field, the scope and potential reach of the Declaration made it necessary for UNESCO to devise a system for its follow-up and implementation, quite an innovation for an instrument that has no binding force. Let me translate several words here. Instrument. you think of an instrument, because you're a research scientist, you think of an instrument like a spoon and a fork, or a filter, or a beaker, a test tube, or an MRI machine. These are instruments. But here we're talking about a legal instrument. It's also an instrument, but it's an instrument that governments can use to make laws. And international instruments are of several types. That one distinction is binding instruments. Binding meaning it's stuck to you. As a country, you have to make a law to implement it. And a non-binding instrument is an instrument which you can choose what you do with it. It's not legally binding in the first sense. Now later, we have what's called international customary law, so that after 10 years or 15 years after this document has been used by many countries and adopted, even though it's non-binding, it has become international customary law, which means, in effect, it's a de facto binding instrument. It's de facto law, because if so many countries in the world develop it, it becomes what's called international custom, meaning you have to follow it. And a judge in a country who doesn't have a specific law can use it and say, the international customary law of the Universal Declaration of Human Genome and Human Rights is that we should do this or that. And we'll see explain some examples where it is the only international law on some examples of science and technology. So, if we continue, this is a preamble from this is written by the then Director General of Unesco, Koichi Matsura, in 2000 when this booklet was released. Of course, it's written as a UNESCO statement with the advice of many staff. On all sides, the wish has been expressed that this system may rapidly become operational, so that the principles enshrined in the text can be translated into reality as soon as possible. The declaration needs to be implemented as a matter of particular urgency in the view of an ever-quickening pace of technical and scientific progress in biology and genetics, where each advance almost unfailingly spawns new hopes for the improved well-being of humanity, together with unprecedented ethical dilemmas. So this was the idea that there could be a system for follow-up and for recommendation. So what happens when one community or country doesn't follow these principles? Can they be reported to the International Bioethics Committee, and can the UNESCO do something about it? And that was the idea, that they would develop some system to be a bioethics policeman in the international community. Now, although it sounds good, of course it's impossible to work. You can see the international order today, even more statutory instruments such as the International Criminal Court. Some countries will say, I don't want to believe, I don't want to accept the jurisdiction of the court. And even the Human Security Council may impose sanctions, and a country will just simply ignore it. You should stop a war today. Okay. Bye-bye. Bang, bang. They continue for 9 or 10 years fighting their war, even if the Human Security Council tells them they should stop. So it has no teeth, so to speak, if we talk about a carnivorous animal as the police. That's the common English expression, no teeth. So, although the idea was good, and it was stated here that the ambition and hope, it's impossible to enforce, even if it's a binding declaration. But it's still something which many people aspire to. And it still makes the world a better place, probably, than not having something like this. But that's some of the context of the principles of doing bioethics through the UN is that you may establish instruments, legal instruments, and they may become even customary law, and how do we implement that? So I'm going to go on to the text of the declaration. And this is a text that is, now I'm going to ask you, if you're not familiar with this text, please keep your eye out for the end of the first sentence. Okay? This is a long sentence. And UNESCO is a general conference of member states. So member states of the organization, like Japan or India, okay, or North Korea or South Korea, these are all member states. Each state is a member. And they all endorsed, every state endorsed this declaration. It gives some background of how we link principles that might apply to the human genome to existing international norms of human rights. So human rights are the current international norm that we have. If we talk between countries, there's not many other principles that are common. The human rights is one, and some others we're going to see in these texts. So it says, the General Conference, recalling the preamble of UNESCO's Constitution, refers to the democratic principles of dignity, equality, and mutual respect of men, rejects any doctrine of inequality of men and races, stipulates that the wide diffusion of culture and the education of humanity for justice and liberty and peace are indispensable to the dignity of men and constitute a sacred duty which all the nations must fulfill in a spirit of mutual assistance and concern. Proclaims that peace must be founded upon the intellectual and moral solidarity of mankind, and states that the organization seeks to advance through educational and scientific and cultural relations of peoples of the world the objectives of international peace and common welfare of mankind, for which the United Nations organization was established and which this charter proclaims, comma. So it's not the end of the sentence, but I just want to explain some parts of this. Firstly, it talks about men. What about women? Okay, so in 1945, and the UN Charter, it doesn't mention women. It mentions men. Now, in some languages, men and women are inclusive in the same language. Nowadays, in modern English, we would say humankind. Humankind is the gender sensitive. And if we're writing a paper, we might say she or him, or her or him, or they. But the UN texts, charters are written in a language in 1945 when they used men to be inclusive of human beings. Although in some cultures, women were not actually human beings because of discrimination. That by 1945, many countries had included women, but not all. It's sort of funny because it says rejects the doctrine of inequality of men and races, but that should be inequality of men and women and races. Okay? Because inequality was still very common. Another word here is the peoples of the world. Okay, so the peoples of the world is an important term. If you know your English grammar, why do they say peoples of the world and not people of the world? What's the difference between people and peoples? And there's a very important difference. The Charter of the United Nations starts, we, the peoples of the world. you look at the text, it says on purpose, and it's very symbolic. It does not say we the nations of the world, and it does not say we the people of the world. It says we the peoples of the world. And what it means is all the different communities, indigenous groups, and different nations, ethnic groups around the world. There's 4,000 or 5,000 peoples in the world who live in different communities. And in 1945, the number of nations in the world was very small because most were colonies. Most nations were colonies. And even today, we have 200 or around 200 nations of the world, not 50 nations of the world. But by the end of the century, we'll have a few hundred more nations of the world. And gradually, we may see this expand as more indigenous peoples get their own countries and nations. But we also see some regional blocks, such as the European Union or ASEAN, coming together to say we are one bloc. But inside that bloc, we saw the European Union get bigger and bigger as some countries divided. And so it's this interesting flow that it represents peoples. And it was also another very interesting reason. If you know the founding nations of the United Nations, they excluded the countries which lost the war, Germany and Japan. So if they're excluded as nations of the United Nations, then how can the Charter apply to them? If firstly the UN is refusing them to become members in 1945, they couldn't become members until some years later. Because they lost the war, bad luck, you're no longer a nation. So then, at least the language of peoples means they are included. The peoples of Japan, the peoples of Germany are included. The nations may not be. So, interesting ethical, philosophical, political issues here. But these basic principles are all good. I mean, intellectual solidarity, peace, that's what we want. So the second paragraph, solemnly recalling its attachment to the universal principles of human rights, affirmed in particular in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 10 December 1948, and in the two international United Nations Covenants on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and on Civil and Political Rights of 16 December 1966. And other international conventions. We have a convention against genocide, the Convention against Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the rights of mentally retarded persons, the Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Persons, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, 1979, the Declaration on Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power, the Convention on Rights for Children get included later, and the Equalization of Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities, the Conventions on Prohibition of Bacteriological, Biological Weapons, and the Convention Against Discrimination in Education, Declaration on Principles of International Cultural Cooperation, UNESCO Recommendation on the Status of Scientific Researchers, the UNESCO Declaration on Race and Racial Prejudice, the International Labour Organization, ILO, Convention Concerning Discrimination in Respect of Employment and Occupation, and a Convention Concerning Indigenous and Tribal People in Independent Countries, 1989, comment. So, in a type of UN declaration, the preface of the declaration includes a reference to the most relevant previous UN conventions and declarations, so that instead of just repeating all the quotations and articles from these declarations, we just mention the name, and therefore it implies all the countries agree these are relevant to the use of human genome. And there's a long history of UN declarations. There's hundreds of them. Okay? The next paragraph is talking about, bearing in mind, it talks about intellectual property. Now you may find it interesting because here it says, bearing in mind and without prejudice to the international instruments which could have a bearing on the applications of genetics in the field of intellectual property, inter alia the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works of 9 September 1886. And then you might suddenly think, doesn't it mean 1986? And the answer is no. It's 1886. So 1886 is an example of an international convention with a longer history than the United Nations. So there are some of these conventions that we have in international law that predate the UN by a long time. Because countries in the world are trying to live together and are trying to develop laws. And we may have heard about actually some religions having laws of how you should behave, which are even older. But the international community is also trying to have laws, trying to fight, to stop war. We're not going to fight a war about copyright of somebody's book or somebody's music. Let's make a convention. It's reasonable if you write a song and Mozart wrote some music, that we should protect Mozart's music. Okay? And if you wrote a famous book, let's say Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in the 19th century, then maybe that's her book. You can't say it's your book. Then we have the Unesco Universal Copyright Convention 1952, and then the Paris Convention for the Protection of Industrial Property of 20th of March 1883, last revised at Stockholm on 14th of July 1967. So here's another interesting aspect of international law. You have the Paris Convention in 1883, which is a living document, last being revised in 1967. I don't know if it's revised since 1998, but it's interesting, isn't it, that we have governments getting together, they make a document, and they sometimes revise it. So that's another principle, that international law started a long time ago. Countries try and work together sometimes. Next paragraph is still the same sentence, bearing in mind the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, and emphasizing in that connection the recognition of the genetic diversity of humanity must not give rise to any interpretation of the social political nature which could call into question the inherent dignity and equal and unalienable rights of all members of the human family, in accordance with the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this was actually a text from one of the working groups we had in the International Bioethics Committee on population genetics. If we do genetics in different populations, can we decide that Bengalis are different to Tamils, and are different to Japanese, and the Ainu are different to the main Japanese, and the Filipinos are different to the Brazilians, and the Brazilians are in fact a mixture of everybody. So what we had is we can't misuse genetics in that way. We may have some genetic differences. There may be some Brahmin genes that are different to genes in the Maori population that maybe Maori chiefs share them. Who knows? And we cannot reduce people to just their DNA. They are all a human family. Okay. Then the next paragraph, recalling these different resolutions, urging UNESCO to develop ethical studies. And then, next paragraph, recognizing research on the human genome opens up vast prospects for progress in improving the health of all individuals and of humankind as a whole, and emphasizing that such research should fulfill human rights, freedom and human rights, as well as the prohibition of all forms of discrimination based on genetic characteristics, proclaims the principles that follow and adopts the present declaration, full stop. Okay, so this is the end of this first sentence. You've just read, we've read together 2 pages. That's a long sentence, isn't it? That's one sentence. When you are writing sentences, are you told to make sentences 2 pages long? Maybe not. When you write your PhD thesis, if you have a 2-page sentence and your supervisor or examiner says, this is too long for a sentence, you say, well, actually, UNESCO makes 2-page sentences, so why can't I? Okay, and you can, of course, if you can defend that your grammar is correct and it makes sense, then you can do it. But generally, what we communicate has different purpose. But this is saying, this is the preface, all that came before these existing legal principles, ethical principles, and moral principles, and international agreements. This is the foundation for us to look at. So now we have the real articles. Article 1, the human genome underlies the fundamental unity of all members of the human family, as well as in the recognition of their inherent dignity and diversity. In a symbolic sense, it's a heritage of humanity. Now, this is an interesting article because, as I told you, there were 10 drafts. 10 drafts of this declaration over 5 years. Experts and countries had to agree. And most of the drafts of this article, we kept Article 1, the human genome is the common heritage of humanity. That was our beautiful worded article. It's much nicer because remember UNESCO in 1972 has a convention on cultural and natural heritage. That's why you have UNESCO heritage sites. So the beauty would be that the human genome is the common heritage of humanity. It's a wonderful sentence. It's what UNESCO stands for. Why is it worded in this way? It's worded in this way so that it cannot be interpreted that you cannot get a patent on DNA. Several countries who wanted to continue to get patents on DNA refused to have an article to say the human genome is a common heritage of humanity. Because if it's a common heritage of humanity, it's under patent law, you can't patent it. Because that's the definition of patent. It can't be something common or owned by everybody. So they had to make this longer sentence just so that several countries who wanted to patent DNA could continue to patent DNA. So that's the science and law of politics. Article 2A, everyone, good afternoon, I can see you. Everyone has the right to respect for their dignity and for their rights regardless of their genetic characteristics. And B, that dignity makes it imperative not to reduce individuals to their genetic characteristics and to respect their uniqueness and diversity. So that's, I think, easy to understand, regardless of if you're different. So, is there any large genetic difference between the people in this room? Some people have a Y chromosome. Are you sorry you don't have a Y chromosome? Maybe you're very pleased you have 2 X's. It makes you actually better than having an X and a Y. Stronger. able to live longer. But we can't reduce people to genetics. We can't say people are different, better. So actually sexism was a genetic discrimination, but so are many others. Article 3, the human genome, which by its nature evolves, is subject to mutations. It contains potentialities that are expressed differently according to each individual's natural and social environment, including an individual's state of health, living conditions, nutrition, and education. Now, this is 1997. What is much more interesting 20 years later is we know so much about epigenetics, and people who drafted this sentences, those of us on the International Bioethics Committee, are so pleased that we knew at least some science to know that epigenetics was happening. Because now, remember the central dogma I talked about, DNA goes to RNA goes to protein. Now we know it goes both ways, doesn't it? The environment methylates our DNA, our genome. And so more than 90% of our genome is regulated by epigenetic modification, by methylation. So it isn't, the DNA is not the controlling thing. The environment interacts. So for those of us who remember in high school discussions, do you remember, between history of genetics between Mendel and Lamarck? Do you remember? And Lamarck's theory was that the giraffe's neck is longer because it goes to reach the higher leaves, and the children get longer necks. And Mendel's theory is it's set by the DNA. And fortunately for Mendel, he did very simple traits of peas where it was very simple numbers. It turns out that both were correct. That somehow the environment modifies the DNA. And the epigenetics is... So we covered in Article 3, as well as the mutation. Article 4, the human genome in its natural state shall not give rise to financial gains. Remember, I just talked about patenting. But what does natural state mean? It means the DNA sitting in your genome. Once you take the DNA out, so you take messenger RNA and you make cDNA, complementary DNA, it's no longer in a natural state. You can get financial gain from that, because it's no longer. Now for us, logically the information is the same, that it's no longer natural state. So that narrow distinction, it was why Article 1 and Article 4 are written in this way. Because some countries wanted to patent the DNA in the human genome, and it's still good. So the first section was a sort of a human dignity and human genome. Section B, rights of the persons concerned. Article 5 is a basic statement of one of the first rights. A, research, treatment, or diagnosis affecting an individual's genome shall be undertaken only after rigorous and prior assessment of the potential risks and benefits pertaining thereto, and in accordance with any other requirement of national law. B, in all cases, the prior, free and informed consent of the person concerned shall be obtained. If the latter is not in a position to consent or authorization shall be obtained in a manner prescribed by law, guided by the person's best interest. C, the right of each individual to decide whether or not to be informed of the results of genetic examination, and the resulting consequences should be respected. D, in the case of research, protocols shall in addition be submitted for prior review in accordance with relevant national and international research standards or guidelines. E, if according to the law a person does not have the capacity to consent, research affecting his or her genome may only be carried out for his or her direct health benefit, subject to the authorization or protected conditions prescribed by law. Research which does not have an expected direct health benefit may only be undertaken by way of exception, with the utmost restraint, exposing the person only to minimal risks and minimal burden, and if the research is intended to contribute to the health benefit of other persons in the same age category.
or with the same genetic condition, subject to the conditions prescribed by law and provided such research is compatible with the protection of individual rights. So Article 5 is the longest article. It's about consent. You have to give consent to something happening to you. So, first step, you need a risk-benefit analysis. We shouldn't even be asking people to do something too risky. That's Article 8. So if you've done a risk-benefit analysis of some intervention, then you can take it, step B, to the prior free and informed consent of a person. Okay. Now step C, it means there's a right not to know. So let's say we can do the DNA analysis and test for different genes. I have a right not to know. So it's my right. You can do the test, and it might be of use for my sister, or my mother, or my child, but I might not want to know. And there are certain diseases where people didn't want to know. So I have a PhD from molecular biology, but I have not sequenced my own genome, even though it's only $1,000 to do now, not $1 billion like it was for the Genome Project. It's so cheap. It's cheaper than a day in hospital. In most countries, it costs you $1,000 or costs the health system $1,000 or more to keep you in hospital. For one day's hospital stay, you can get your DNA sequenced. So people ask me, why haven't you got your DNA sequenced? And I guess one day maybe it will be useful for me, but I don't really need it and haven't felt the need to do so. And also, there are many consequences of knowing the knowledge. So, for example, if I know the knowledge that I'm going to die of a genetic disease quite soon, honestly, I can't go to an insurance company and ask for insurance. It would be unethical for me to do so, because I know I'm at high risk. I prefer not to know. Maybe I'm going to lose the way, different faculties of my personality. So I might prefer that. Maybe I'm from a particular group of people and I don't want to know my ancestors. And maybe I do want to know my ancestors. So it's up to people. It's a consent. Now the case of number E is, what about children or people who are mentally incapable to give a free and prior informed consent? It's still important to do research, especially if you have a genetic disease. You need to probably take genetic samples to find out what's happening. Okay, so why does studying the brain so many conditions affect children's brain? If I want to understand what's happening, I need to take some samples, but I can't get consent. So under certain conditions, you can authorize to take the sample. We may use a proxy, which is usually the parents, or it might be somebody else. Okay, so that's the consent. Article 6, no one shall be subjected to discrimination based on genetic characteristics that are intended to infringe or have an effect of infringing human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity. So Article 6 is about discrimination, but it doesn't say you can't discriminate based on genetics. Why doesn't it say that? Well, certain conditions, it would be perhaps reasonable to discriminate to protect the health. And the case that's often given is, do you know hemophilia? Hemophilia is my blood count clot. Okay? So let's say we have a young lady who wants to become a chef. And she wants to be a sashimi cutter. But she's a hemophiliac. Is this a good profession for her? It's probably not a good profession, because once soon she cuts herself, she may well die. Okay. So it might be reasonable to encourage her, please think about some other occupation. Maybe you can be on making cakes, not doing sashimi. Maybe that's better for you. And then you can avoid using the knife so much. So that's an example of discrimination. Or maybe you're really clever and I want to take you to an advanced placement class in school. I'm going to discriminate against you by putting you in a class that's more suited to your learning. Or you're a great musician, so you're perfect pitch. Let's go to music school early, if you want. I'm discriminating, but it's not infringing your human rights, actually, probably enhancing them. So that's discrimination. Article 7. Genetic data associated with an identifiable person and stored or processed for the purposes of research or any other purpose must be held confidential in the conditions set by law. So genetic data is private. What's interesting is later, after this, most countries realized actually all data should be private. And after the Human Genome Declaration, we have privacy laws in the last 10 years or so. A lot more protection of privacy. And now we're worried about privacy on, social media, smartphones, all sorts of things. But actually the ethical principles were articulated and developed in a specific case about the human genome. And this is one of the interesting aspects of this. The consequences for the general discussion of global ethics were that the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, the General Declaration, which I've also given a copy to you, is in 2005. But the Human Genome Declaration is 1997. Logically, it should be the other way around. You should have a general declaration and then make a specific one to apply. But the international community was not ready to make a general declaration of ethics in the 1990s. But the Human Genome Project catalyzed our reflection to do something about science and society and ethics. And then having done that, we then came back to the general. So that's the history of why the specific one comes before the general one. It's just in the history of human thinking, we were not ready for a general UN declaration on ethics in the 1990s. Remember, the Cold War only finished, or meant to finish, in 1989. And the UN had been largely dysfunctional until the end of the Cold War. Although it surprisingly had some conventions on human rights, and of course many other good things that people did. But in terms of people had more dreams about what the UN could deliver. Now, whether it was functional or not is another interesting question that we discuss. Article 8, each individual shall have a right, according to international and national law, to just reparation for any damage sustained as a direct and determining result of an intervention affecting his or her genome. So it's an international legal principle. If somebody does gene therapy and attempts on you to change your genes to make you better, and something harmful is done, under international law, you have a right to compensation. So it's interesting. In fact, even though gene therapy has not really been successful, it's been talked about since the 1960s, longer than most other therapies. And it's because it's sort of a dream therapy that very difficult to get going. Article 9, in order to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, limitations to the principles of consent and confidentiality may only be prescribed by law for compelling reasons within the bounds of public international law and the international law of human rights. So here it's saying, if we are limiting application of consent to confidentiality, it should only be for international human rights law. Now you are researchers, so article, this section C, research on the human genome, article 10. No research or research applications concerning the human genome, in particular in the fields of biology, genetics, and medicine, should prevail over respect for the human rights, fundamental freedoms, and even dignity of individuals or applicable groups of people. So we also added the groups of people because of population genetics. That sometimes groups of people will be affected. We had a history of eugenics, which means good genes, which was abused when people were selected because of the genetic or racial characteristics. Article 11 is an article which was modified after the committee finished its work by the governments, and I'll tell you why. Article 11, let's read it. It says, practices which are contrary to human dignity, such as reproductive cloning of human beings, shall not be permitted. States and competent international organizations are invited to cooperate in identifying such practices and then taking at the national and international level the measures necessary to ensure the principles set out in this declaration are respected. Now, the words I highlight here were added in 1997 because of a specific scientific discovery in 1997. Can you guess what the discovery was? What the paper was? What happened in 1997? You may be born. Great news.
Human clone?
Which clone?
Human clone of
Yeah, so not the human clone.
It's a cloning. First cloning.
Cloning of a sheep, Dolly. Okay, so Dolly the sheep, the paper was released at the end of February 1997. So the international community thought, well, soon we're going to have human cloning. How are we going to stop human cloning? So this was very timely. Now, for 5 years, our International Bioethics Committee had wanted to make a declaration which will last forever. Let's say, well, how long? So we didn't want any specific example. We specifically didn't want examples. But the government experts and the governments in their meeting decided to insert this, such as reproductive cloning of human beings, into Article 11 because it was then going to say that Unesco was leading the world in regulating cloning and going to protect it. In the same year, the World Health Organization also added an article to one of their texts about against human cloning. So it was like the Me Too movement, that we can do it and you can do it. Different organizations immediately wanted to have something to try and stop human cloning. Philosophically, I can think of examples where human cloning is not against human dignity. Okay. So, for example, if you were desperately forced by your culture and your family to have a child genetically, and you may in fact be killed, certainly divorced, if you don't have this child, in many cultures still today. So, could a mother use parthenogenesis and you make a clone using just have a child? That would be a clone. Is it against human dignity to make one child? Probably not. If it's safe, now actually it's not safe. So in that sense, it's dangerous because we don't know precisely what's going to happen to the current methods of cloning. Now, interestingly, if I were to clone by splitting embryos, it's also cloning, but it's not included in here. Because I can split an embryo from assisted reproductive technology and make two of them. And this was suggested for many years by Robert Edwards and others who developed it to say, well, we can increase the number of embryos by splitting an early embryo so you can implant 2 instead of 1 and you increase your chances. That's a clone, identical twins. In nature, we have identical twins and occasionally identical triplets. Okay. You may not have heard of identical triplets because it's not common. But it's like a bonanza or bonus. If you want lots of children, suddenly you end up, instead of 1, you have 3 triplets. It happens sometimes. The twins are kind of common. So there was much debate about this. Interestingly, however, it has become customary international law because most countries have agreed they don't really want reproductive human cloning because we don't know the ethics too well and it's actually unsafe. So this article has become customary international law. And it's the only law which really protects, for many people, many countries, against reproductive cloning. Because only a few countries have a law against reproductive cloning. Japan is one of these countries which does. It has almost very few laws in this field, but that's one of them. Okay, so that's an example of legal processes. Article 12 is important especially if you're a research scientist, and especially if you're working in different countries. Article 12A. Benefits from advances in biology, genetics, and medicine concerning the human genome should be made available to all with due regard for dignity and human rights of each individual. And B. Freedom of research, which is necessary for the progress of knowledge, is part of the freedom of thought. The applications of research, including applications of biology, genetics, and medicine, concerning the human genome, shall seek to offer relief from suffering and improve the health of individuals and humankind as a whole. So it's combining two principles. One is benefit sharing, that we share benefits between countries. And importantly, 12B, if you're a scientist, a researcher, freedom of research is a human right. Your government cannot tell you not to research. And so if you ever go to a country where they say, you cannot research, you have to quote, well, didn't your country agree to the UNESCO Declaration? And in fact, freedom of research is in many UNESCO declarations that most every country agrees to. So it's trying to guarantee the freedom of thought, because freedom of thought, thinking, is also a basic human right. And freedom of research extends from that. But then we have a question, can I do research on guinea pig brains? Can I do research on human embryo brains? Can I do research on the students in my classroom? Yes, yes, yes. Why not? Freedom of research. It depends, again, on these principles of harm and benefit. So these are interesting questions. But in some countries, you'll go to prison if you research a human embryo. And in another country, you can get the Nobel Prize. Okay. It's interesting, isn't it? So it means we can move between countries depending on what our ethics want to be. And of course, in the public in each country, there are people who oppose certain types of research and oppose others. There are people who don't want animal research. There are people who don't want human embryo research. There are people who don't want research on homosexuality. There are people who don't want research on aging. So, what do? Well, it says it's freedom of research. Article 13 is also says something about scientific ethics. The responsibilities inherent in the activities of researchers, including meticulousness, caution, intellectual honesty, and integrity in carrying out their research, as well as in the presentation and utilization of their findings, should be the subject of particular attention in the framework of research on the human genome because of its ethical and social implications. Public and private science policymakers also have particular responsibilities in this regard. So, you are meticulous, is that right? Hopefully. You're cautious, intellectually honest, and have integrity when you carry out a research, when you present it and utilize. You don't suddenly say, I did an experiment on skinny pig and it's now a super pig. We can do it immediately on all human beings and we no longer need to spend so much money on education. Okay? The brains will be, this will save 2 years of schooling for all the people in the world. It's a wonderful research. Okay, congratulations, and let's do it. So as a scientist, you wouldn't say that. You might say, I need to do a bit more research, but that's quite interesting, and please, I think it's justified to give me some funding for doing this. Give me a postdoc position up right now, I need it, okay, after my PhD. So but if we have too much caution, we're never going to do something new. It's one of the great lessons I was told by some of my mentors, is that if you're going to write a paper, say something that hasn't been said, or say something provocative, and it will probably be more interesting. But of course you should be intellectually honest and say something that actually is some basis of being true. Otherwise people will think we're just saying nonsense. But if you're just boring and say the same old thing, that's what you're going to do. So this is some responsibilities, which is an international principle of law. Scientists should be meticulous and cautious and honest and have integrity. Article 14 states should take appropriate measures to foster the intellectual and material conditions favorable to freedom and the conduct of research on the human genome. Consider the ethical, legal, and social implications of such research. Article 15 states should take appropriate steps to provide a framework for the free exercise of research on the human genome with due regard to the principles set out in the Declaration, in order to safeguard respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity, and protect public health. They should seek to ensure research results are not used for non-peaceful purposes. Okay, well, Article 15, the last sentence is okay, but what about military research, which funds a lot of research? If you live in a country such as the United States or England, where a lot of research is funded by the Department of Defense, it may be a little bit difficult to ensure that your research may not be used in that. Article 16, states should recognize the value of promoting at various levels as appropriate the establishment of independent, multidisciplinary, and pluralist ethics committees to assess the ethical, legal, and social issues raised by research on the human genome and its implications. So in the bioethics community, the principles of ethical research and institutional review boards, ethics committees, these are mainstream. It's legally required. It should be established. Okay. Because we need to govern what happens in the research to avoid abuses. Solidarity, international cooperation, so Article 17, states should respect and promote the practice of solidarity towards individuals, families, and population groups who are particularly vulnerable or affected by disease or disability of a genetic character. They should foster inter alia research on the identification, prevention, and treatment of genetically based and genetically influenced diseases, and particularly rare, as well as endemic diseases that affect large numbers of the world's population. So the principle of solidarity was included here, and families who suffer from a history of genetic disease need support. They need to do research. So if you have somebody saying, we can't do research on this disease, you have to ask them, well, what about people who review your disease who actually want to get a cure, who want to know what to do? So Article 18 was dissemination, international dissemination of scientific knowledge concerning the human genome, human diversity, and genetic research, foster scientific and cultural cooperation. Article 19 was the framework of states should encourage measures to assess the risks and benefits of research, develop capacity in developing countries to carry out research on human biology and genetics, taking into consideration the specific problems to be developed and strengthened. 3, developing countries to benefit from the achievements of scientific and technological research so that their use in favour of economic and social progress can be of benefit to everyone. And 4, the free exchange of scientific knowledge and information in biology, genetics, and medicine should be promoted. And if you know the context in the 1990s, many scientists were opposed to the commercialization of the Human Genome Project and the patenting. So this was also a reaction to say, we need to share knowledge. It should be in the public domain. Promotion of the principles, Article 20, states should take appropriate measures. States means countries. And they should also, through educational and relevant means, inter alia, through the conduct of research and training in interdisciplinary fields, and through the promotion of the education of bioethics at all levels, in particular for those responsible for science policies. Bioethics education at all levels means we start school, and many countries have now established school bioethics programs, and that's what a lot of my work has been doing. Article 21, measures to promote forms of research and training. So we can see here an implementation was trying to get the implementation through different bodies and to be a sort of policing to countries which break the Bioethics Declaration. So that is, in essence, the Universal Declaration on Human Genome and Human Rights. It was a foundation, it was a document to first look at bioethics as international principles. And briefly, I want to also look at another document, just to show you. I'm not going to read through. The 2005 Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. At the beginning, this is a more general, not just on the human genome, but all aspects. And the preface I'm not going to read. It's another long preface with even more documents. Okay? It goes for 3 pages, not 2 pages. It's a long sentence, even longer. It has aims and has some principles. So the first part is principles, and I'll just look at the heading. So Article 3, principles, a principle of human dignity and human rights. So what is interesting, again, in a 2005 document, how does the UN approach principles of bioethics? It looks at the common principles that you can think about. What doesn't it include that you might think would have been useful for scientists and researchers to know and for the public? So Article 3, human dignity and human rights should be protected. Article 4, benefit and harm should be balanced. Article 5, autonomy comes with individual responsibility. Okay, so you have autonomy, freedom to make a choice, but that means responsibility. You drive a car, you ride a bicycle, you have to be a responsible rider or driver, don't you? Okay. You can kill people with a bicycle. And so you have to be responsible. Article 6, consent. Article 7, persons without the capacity to consent. More in detail, how do we deal with these people? Very important, because these are vulnerable people, children, and people who can't make decisions. Article 8, I should say they can't make legally binding decisions, they still can make decisions. And in fact, how do we get children's assent, meaning they start to say yes or no, as developed? It's before legal consent is recognized. We still recognize the rights of the child. A 10-year-old child can say yes or no to something, even though legally it may not be binding. Article 8, respect for human vulnerability and personal integrity. Okay, when you go to a hospital, of course you do research in a hospital, but if you're going to a hospital as a general public, you go to the hospital because you're sick, you're vulnerable. So it needs to be particularly protected. Privacy and confidentiality. Article 10, equality, justice and equity. Article 11 now, non-discrimination and non-stigmatization. Not just for genetics, it's now for everything. Article 12, respect for cultural diversity and pluralism. The challenge here is cultural diversity. Okay, so what happens if I don't want to eat beef in one country, but another country wants to eat beef? You let them eat the beef. One country wants to eat elephants, another country says you shouldn't eat elephants. One country says I want to eat human beings, another country says you shouldn't eat human beings. Should you eat human beings? Is it tasty? Should I ask such questions? Is it shocking? We can kill human beings in a war. We can kill them by not giving them food. We can kill them by bad policy, but we can't eat them. Fortunately. But actually in some countries they do. And there are ethics of some countries that might be cannibals. Their ethics might be better in some regards than some other countries who claim to protect human beings. So, cultural diversity is interesting. Solidarity and cooperation, social responsibility and health, sharing of benefits. So these are questions that Article 16, protecting future generations, and Article 17, finally something about protecting the environment, biosphere, and biodiversity. I'm going to open for questions. In here we've seen the application of legal principles of human rights, of how they might apply bioethics. So you might say, well, what does this say about animal experiments? And the answer is nothing directly. It says about principles, benefit and harm, equality, justice, solidarity, and I can extend it to animals if I want. What does it say about abortion? It says nothing directly. Then it talks about consent, it talks about principles. Why doesn't it mention why does the Bioethics Declaration not mention animal rights or abortion or euthanasia? It's because it's a document for every country in the world to agree to. And they agreed to it, every country agreed to it. You cannot have an international document on abortion where every country agrees to, because abortion laws are different. You cannot have a common document on animal rights, because some countries think
animals are more precious than in other countries. Okay, but we have principles, and the principles we're meant to learn, be educated, and then to think for ourselves. And that's the message, I guess, of the development of bioethics, that we try to get people to think for themselves, and then each country, each community can decide its limits. Okay, so do you have some questions? Start with you, please.
You say that these articles
Yeah.
are written by the committee,
Yes.
and it was changed by like the each and every country's culture.
It's changed by the government experts. So the committee is independent experts. So you don't represent India, but you're an Indian scientist. Okay? So you can come on the committee as an Indian scientist, but you can't represent the country of India. But if you were, the government might, in the government discussions, decide we're going to represent somebody who can speak on behalf of our country. It may be a diplomat, or it might even be a scientist. But they're not delegated to speak on behalf of 1.4 billion people and say you can speak. But you're speaking as an intellectual. So the committees, the principle of many of these UNESCO work is committees will be independent experts so that it doesn't become so political. And then independent experts will then, the final document needs to be agreed by member states. Member states will then become political.
After this like negotiation, kind of negotiation,
Yeah.
after that they are writing this kind of, means editing, each and every year is
Each
edited.
draft edited. So in the case of the Human Genome Project, there were about 10 drafts over 5 years. But in the case of the Universal Declaration of Bioethics, they wanted the document quickly, so there were less drafts. They wanted a quick one because of the funding and the political expediency. It's sort of interesting. If you want, why do you want to have a declaration? So actually, what happened is that some countries, in that process, I went from being an international expert to, I joined UNESCO as a staff member in 2005, representing the regional advisor for Asia and Pacific. And so I've been initially on the declaration as an expert, as an individual, then I actually represent another United Nations university, another agency, and then came as UNESCO staff, so my perspective has to change, but then I'm still an intellectual, so I'm trying to see what would be practical for people and what would be really the expression of values for the Asia Pacific region. But later, when organising meetings in some countries, like Samoa and Fiji, they said UNESCO was impolite to rush this declaration without having a meeting and community discussion. And it was impolite, because you need to have a meeting in each country to decide on what's global bioethics. But they tried to get general principles which could be accepted. And one of the things that I'll just tell you, if you're interested, that in almost all UN declarations there is a definition section at the beginning. But in the Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights, all the drafts had a definition section. The government experts could not agree on the definition. So in order to get the document agreed to, at the end, the last day, they decided we can't agree. We remove the definition section altogether. So it's a declaration with no definition of what bioethics is, because they couldn't agree. It was related partly to some people believing that life starts at conception and the rights of life, and the Catholic Church influence, and
some other religious groups, and others saying that this should not be included. So when these difficult issues come, sometimes the only way to get agreement is to remove the text that we can't agree on. So that's why there's no animal rights, there's no definition of bioethics. Couldn't agree. But it's still, all the countries to decide that it's still important to have the declaration because it's still a useful document.
I have another question.
Yes.
Like nowadays, genetic modification is very much in practice. So, what is their thinking used or thinking on genetic modifications?
Firstly, Unesco is an organization which just brings together all the member states. So it's what all 200 countries think. And so if it's happening in their countries because the governments are supporting and funding that research, it means the governments are supporting it. So regarding genetic modification of plants and animals, it's a long-held position of the UN that it's useful for agriculture and medicine. Yeah. It's been studied in medicine. Yeah. You can make many medical drugs and hormones made with genetic modification. It's a standard procedure. Governments fund it, governments license it. So, of course, the agencies they join, the UN, is just the voice of all the nations together. But in terms of some issues such as human genetic enhancement, if I were to make you smarter, that might be more controversial as it is in some countries too. Some questions?
I'm interested in those experiment animal because now I'm using the animal for my experiment.
What animals are you using?
Mice.
Mice.
Yeah.
Mickey Mouse?
It seems like Mickey Mouse.
Okay.
So you say UNESCO don't have any direct principle for experiment?
No. There's no direct mention of it because countries disagree on issues.
Okay.
But many of these ethical principles you can apply to animals. Yeah. Countries. So consent. Can you get consent to the mouse? Well, we have to substitute consent. So we have to have first a risk-benefit analysis done before in the experiment. Okay? So risks and benefits. And we have international principles of animal experiments, reducing harm. And so some of these ethical principles apply to animals.
I think it's very different from country. For example, Japan is not so strict, I think, but USA is very strict for experimental animals.
Well, it actually is interesting. If you look at the US Department of Agriculture guidelines, the standard guidelines on the ethical guidelines for animals in the United States, okay, it looks very strict. But you have to look at the section on the definition of an animal. You may be surprised a mouse is not an animal. Mouse and rats are excluded from the definition of an animal because they wanted to do research on mice and animals. So it may look, isn't that crazy? That a mouse is not an animal. It's a big surprise for them. But that's how the guidelines can be modified to do anything. Because you suddenly say that a mouse is not an animal. So they exclude rodents from the general guidelines. Now there are other guidelines which may include mice, but the main ones simply excluded mouse and rats because rodents is a class, because they wanted freedom for research. So it's the same as Japan. Where it's interesting is chimpanzees. Because chimpanzees in Europe are great apes, they are against the law to do destructive experiments on great apes in New Zealand or in Europe. And Japan is like in the US and some other countries are still using chimps, that the trend will be to get rid of chimpanzees. And Europe and a few countries have done this. So some of the great, high great apes like us and chimpanzees have stricter guidelines. We should give consent.
Another
Yes.
questions, like bioethic people and the Unesco, both are same and or different. I have some confusion.
Oh yeah, so yes, no, UNESCO is just the organization, the same as WHO is an organization, the same as Komodo University is an organization. It's composed of, but the difference is UN organizations, their members are countries, nation states, whereas the members of the Komodo University are people, and your mice and guinea pigs are members of the university too, maybe. Okay. But it's not states, it's individuals. And bioethicists are those beings who think about bioethics, okay, which include you, bioethics people, think about bioethics. Maybe my computer thinks about bioethics. It's an artificial intelligence machine, it would be an bioethicist. Maybe a chimpanzee who thinks, who am I? It's a bioethics. And in the workshop, you're going to learn about what's bioethics, which will be fun for you, because it's much broader. A little bit much more interesting questions. So, any organization has constraints on what it can do. Thank you very much for your questions. I think we need to move on.